Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan is a genial man. He's a warm person, but he's also a man of fierce will. And there is this great story of how in the 1920s he was in jail, and in jail with him were members of the Akali party, right? And over there, this interesting incident happens where the British jailers ask the Akalis to remove their turban, and the Akalis don't want to remove their turban because that's against Sikhism. So they remove all their clothes, they strip down to their underwear, so just their underwear and the turban, and they say, "Sar jave to jave, mera Sikh dharm na jave." And Bacha Khan, who witnesses this, is deeply inspired by this. I mean, it's not his faith, but it is faith, it is principles, it is fighting against authority and oppression. Welcome to Everything is Everything. I'm Amit. This is my good friend Ajay. And today, as you can see from the title, we are going to talk about movies we'd like to see. Ajay, look at me. Ajay, concentrate, focus. Tell our dear readers, our gentle readers, why we came up with this idea, movies we'd like to see.
It started at the movie Dunkirk, which is 2017. Dunkirk 1940 is a story that we've all read in the history books. It's a great story. It's a very inspiring story. But it was something when modern movie making and storytelling through cinema was brought to bear on this story. And I just felt like we were in a time machine and we were being taken back there. And it was a thrilling and heart-stopping experience. And then I thought, hey, why stop there? Okay. There are so many other scenes from history that linger on our imagination. And I'm sure you, gentle reader, have 6 of your own. So Amit and I thought that why don't we come up with some great ideas for movie makers? And one of these days, Amit is going to become one of the world's great movie makers, and we're actually giving away some of his concepts.
I mean, you left me speechless there for a moment, but yeah, so we are going to share 7 stories today, 4 by me, 3 by you. These stories, I think, also reveal a bit about us and the things that we care about. Except that you don't know my 4 stories and I don't know your 3 stories, so it'll be really interesting. And yeah, it's time to get going.
So Amit, tell us your first idea for what should be a movie.
This should not be a movie, it should be a web series. So my first idea is for a web series, and I actually conceptualized it and thought aloud about it while recording an episode with Mukulika Banerjee, who I mentioned in a previous episode, right? Now, there are 2 strands to this, and I think of there being an opening scene which intercuts between 2 different scenes. And one is a lot of people marching, a massive crowd of people marching somewhere, many wearing red kurtas like me, and I'll tell you why. And they're marching somewhere, and the year is 1988. And as the camera pulls back and back and back, you see that this is a long, snaking procession which is going on and on and on, right? And the other scene is there is a dark jail cell. A man is sitting in a corner. And then in the distance, he sees feet coming into the frame. And then there is a pitter-pattering of, the different feet of grown men, hairy feet, manly feet, as it were, walking in a particular way. And as the camera pulls up, you notice that all these men are wearing nothing but kachas and turbans, right? So these are the 2 scenes which are interspersed. And here is what the story is. It's got 2 parallel narratives. One narrative begins at this mass gathering of people, which is the funeral of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan in 1988. He died in Peshawar, and he wanted to be buried, I think, in Jalalabad. So there was a massive procession of tens of thousands of people, which was joined by the then Afghan president, and which sort of, accompanied his body to his grave. It was a mass celebration of a great man. And there is this young woman who is watching on from a distance, not watching on because she's not literally in Afghanistan, but watching on from a distance where she's doing her PhD in India. And that woman is Mukulika Banerjee, with whom I did the episode. And she begins to ask herself a question, because in all her academic studies, you know, what she has been told is that that there are two misconceptions people have, and one misconception, or I wouldn't say misconceptions at this point because they are conventional beliefs, but one conventional belief is that peasants don't do mass movements, they don't take part in politics. And the second conventional belief is that Pathans are a violent people, they're a frontier tribe, right? And she is sitting here wondering, you know, thinking about this man, looking back at what is known about him in the public domain, uh, and wondering how did this man, a Pathan who grew up among peasants, lead the greatest nonviolent resistance movement in the subcontinent. In fact, to the extent that Mahatma Gandhi was inspired by Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan's movement, and he once, called it the actual practical representation of the idealistic nonviolence that he believed in his heart. So it was that kind of a movement, and she started asking herself this question. And at one point, she spoke to an advisor of hers that I'm wondering if I should do a PhD. What should I do it on? And he said, only do a PhD if you have a question that keeps you up at night, which you are desperate to answer. And she had this question. So she wanted to do a PhD. Not so simple, because everyone in India repeatedly turned her down. They said, listen, you're a woman. You can't go to Northwest Frontier Province and among the Pathans and all that. And this is late 1980s, right? You can't do this shit. So for 2 years, she tried to scramble for funding. No one supported her project. But then she manages to get funding, I think some of it from abroad. My episode with her has the details. And then she actually she takes 10 years to write the book, The Pathan Unarmed, which is the name of the book she writes. And she spends a few months in the Northwest Frontier Provinces. She learns Pashto, right? She starts wearing a chador. She blends in. She embraces the culture, not in a superficial way, but she embraces it to kind of figure out what it's all about. And she goes from village to village looking for survivors of the Khudai Khidmatkar who were wiped out after partition. And one part of the story I told in an earlier episode, that all what they eat, generally their staple food is beef, but every household has an expensive chicken that they keep, and they give it to their honored guests, and they are doing mehman nawazi. And she doesn't want that expensive thing to be given to her everywhere she goes, so she starts eating beef. And then when she goes back to India much later, she tells her mother, who is a devout Hindu, and the mother thinks about it, because eating beef, but then she says, bete theek kiya apne, insaniyat hi to hai, which is a beautiful story that moves me deeply. So this is one sort of narrative, this 10-year journey of writing the book. And I'll tell you what her conclusion is after I talk about the second strand. The second parallel narrative stars Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. Now we think of revolutionaries as, one-dimensional men in some ways, and
So your movie is nonlinear editing with the two?
it's
With
a
one
web,
story of
it's a web
Mukulika?
series. So
Okay, so one story is Mukulika and one story is Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan.
one story is Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, also known as Badshah Khan, also known as Bacha Khan, also known as Frontier Gandhi, many things, Sarhadi Gandhi, as it were. So Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan is a genial man. He's a warm person, but he's also a man of fierce will. And there is this great story of how in the 1920s he was in jail, and in jail with him were members of the Akali party, right? And over there, this interesting incident happens where the British jailers ask the Akalis to remove their turban. And the Akalis don't want to remove their turban because that's against Sikhism. So they remove all their clothes, they strip down to their underwear, so just their underwear and their turban. And they say, Sar jave to jave, mera Sikh dharm na jave. And Bacha Khan, who witnesses this, is deeply inspired by this. I mean, it's not his faith, but it is faith, it is principles, it is fighting against authority and oppression. And he's written a great autobiography as well, which we'll link from the show notes, where he talks about the people he meets in jail, like Baba Kharak Singh, of again of the Akali Dal, a great leader and also a spiritual man. And reading that autobiography, and we both read about that period, one thing we both realize is that there were periods of time where your best minds, your finest intellectuals were not in universities, they were not in think tanks, they were not in air-conditioned cafes, they were in jails. And this becomes a formative experience for him. Then in 1930, he founds this party, the Khudai Khidmatgar, which is based on, literally translated, it means servants of God. And I would not think of this God as something literal, his God, or the God of Islam, or the God of the Pathans, or whatever. I would think of this as a set of higher principles, and we say that we will be servants to them. That is a spirit with which he goes in. The movement that he is part of involves people across the country, like that allyship with the Akali Dal that I alluded to earlier, they're all taking inspiration from each other. Gandhi at first sees in him a kindred soul, then he sees in him an inspiration, right? And it starts with 1,000 members in 1930, it's 25,000 members by 1931, and then it expands eventually to lakhs of people who like to wear red kurtas and march. So therefore, they are called lal kurti or red shirts, which is why I wore this today. And I asked you, Ajay Shah, please wear a red shirt, but you didn't appear to have a. You said you didn't have a red
I
shirt
don't
or
own a single
a red shirt.
vaguely red shirt.
It's not one of my favorite colors and I don't wear it. But for this occasion, it sort of had to be done. So, a deeply inspiring man, and they are responding to all kinds of provocations with mature non-violence, principled civil resistance, right? So there is, just as in Indian mythology, the mythology of our freedom struggle, as it were, we often hear of Jallianwala Bagh. There was a similar massacre at this bazaar in Peshawar called Kissa Khawani, where 200 people were killed. And in 2006, I have been to Kissa Khawani. I actually wrote a blog post called Twilight in the Street of Storytellers. And I had no idea of the history of this place, how resonant it was. I just thought that it looks fantastic. I love the people here, and I took a lot of photographs which I posted, but I had no idea. So, anyway, that's a digression. And so this movement happens, and they oppose partition because this is not what they were fighting for. So Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and the Khudai Khidmatgar oppose partition, and then when partition is inevitable, they say, okay, then we want Pashtunistan. Give us a land for the Pashtuns, and that doesn't happen. And they decide to stay in Pakistan when Pakistan is formed, but the Pakistani state destroys them because these are free thinkers. And now that the state has decided that this is the direction we must go in, there is no space for free thinkers. So the Pakistani state destroys them, and they are effectively irrelevant as a political force at that time. Many of them go to jail, many of them are killed, and eventually they sort of disappear. And many, many years later, even in 1988, when Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan dies a lonely old man from complications because of a stroke, people still remember this. It still means something to the common people. Yeah, the state might have forgotten you and cast you away, but it still means something to the common people. And we come back now to the central question. We come back to the Mukulika narrative. A book is released, I think, around 9/11, right? And the dominant theme then is that, oh, Islam, violence, it's a problem, blah, blah, blah. And her book is setting out to answer the question, how did this great non-violent movement emerge? And I will quote her words to tell you what her answer was. Bacha Khan highlighted the virtue of patience in Islam and stressed the idea of the greater jihad, Jihad-e-Akbar, to help people understand that the real struggle was a spiritual one within, to conquer fear of the enemy and anger and to forgive them. The movement also utilized the key values of Pashtun custom, of ghairat or courage, Melmassia or hospitality, Badal or revenge, Nanavatai offering refuge to anyone, even the enemy, to treat the colonial government as unwanted guests who had breached the code of hospitality and needed to be evicted politely but firmly. The uncivilized and violent response from the visitors was met with great dignity and unwavering courage until eventually they did leave in 1947. The revolutionary ideology the Khudai Khidmatgars fashioned was thus rooted organically in their society and therefore readily communicable and comprehensible to its rank and file. So this is her really remarkable and inspiring, answer to the question of where did this come from. And this is often something that is said about our freedom fighters and people like Gandhi that, oh, these are Western values. They've imported Enlightenment values. They're not here in India. Another thing is India contains multitudes. India contains the opposite values. India can, our culture can cater to the worst of our instincts, but it can also cater to the best of our instincts. And all of these beautiful values which come intellectually from the Enlightenment also exist organically around us if we just care to look hard enough. And I think this would be a fascinating web series because you have these incredible human stories. The quest for this young researcher to understand the modern world, where, so much is breaking down around her, where people speak of a quote unquote clash of civilizations. And at the same time, the quest of Badshah Khan, a man in the Northwest Frontier province, who is also fighting for a higher cause, who is a servant of God, but a servant of a greater God than many of us would, define.
Yeah, this is so interesting. Um, I will sign up to watch this web series, even though I don't have a Netflix subscription.
So Ajay, before I ask you what is your blockbuster film, I must tell anybody watching this, whether they are in Netflix or Prime or their producers somewhere, that we volunteer to be showrunners and writers for if any of these actually get made. But on that note, I don't know if you have aspirations of that type, but you should. Why do you just want to be a card carrying economist? So boring.
No, no, I am a happy customer. So first of all, I'm going to tell. Uh, yeah, so let me tell you one
Tell me your
story,
story.
and it's been stuck in my mind forever. And today's movie making and computer technology is ready to do justice to this story. Okay, so the story runs like this: that in late 1942, the German Sixth Army, led by General Paulus, was encircled in Stalingrad. Okay, so all of us know that story, that 250,000 people were trapped, encircled inside Stalingrad. And there was a great debate in Hitler's team on how to organize the breakout, how quickly to try to break out. And that question turns on supplies. So, in under normal conditions, that group of 250,000 people required about 700 to 900 tons of supplies per day, because you got to stay fed, and you have fuel and you have ammunition, and there is an immense requirement of logistics. And conceptually, that's why encirclement is so critical. A modern army will collapse in no time, because once you're encircled, supplies are not going through. Now, just a year before that, actually, the Germans had dealt with one encirclement of about 100,000 people near Leningrad. And while they were trapped for some time, they were supplied by air. So there were planes going in carrying supplies, and that band was able to hold on based on purely aerial supply. And then later on, the main body was able to blast through and connect up with them and rescue them. So it had been done before, 1 year before, under different conditions, only 100,000 people, in the absence of the Soviet Air Force. Okay? Many, many differences under conditions, but it had been done before. So, in desperation, uh, Hitler's team thought that while we figure out what to do to rescue these guys, let's do supply by air. And 700 to 900 tons, it was like inconceivable. They agreed that the bare minimum survival point was 300 tons a day. If you could get 300 tons a day to them, then that was a bare minimal survival point. And it's a horrible place to be. People would be starving, but it would keep them alive until the plans are made to mount a rescue or for them to break out, and so on. And there were two airfields from which that project started. And today, historians have made the calculations. There was a grand total of 500 transports in the entire Eastern Front. And if 400 out of those 500 were dedicated to this project, then you could have got 300 tons across. And the quick answer is no, that kind of resourcing was not dedicated to this project, because they were actually fighting on a 1500-kilometer front, and transports were required everywhere. So there was an inadequate version of this, that is 150 tons a day were going through. Okay, so remember, we started at a baseline physical connectivity requirement of 7 to 900 tons, an objective of the aerial resupply of 300 tons a day, and a reality of 150 tons a day. Okay, there were transports carrying 2.5 tons, doing a sortie, flying for 1.5 hours. They get unloaded, then they get swapped in with wounded prisoners, and they fly back, and they would just keep on doing these sorties. One thing that people don't think enough about is that unlike modern cars, which are phenomenally good engineering and are also relatively heavy, planes have to be light. And that's the trade-off, is that a lot of spares on planes are designed to wear out quickly. So planes can't fly continuously. So after a certain number of kilometers, a plane has to stop and undergo a lot of maintenance. Many parts need to change. Okay, this is how planes are, that you can't just keep on flying them. So it's one thing to own a plane. It's a different thing for that plane to be airworthy, because every X kilometers, it's got to stop and get a lot of servicing done. So when you're doing intensive sorties, then you also have to do intensive repairs and maintenance, and that also creates downtime. Okay, so this whole drama was happening from two airfields, one that was a little further out and one that was a little closer, which is called Tatsinskaya. And basically, that's the scene of the movie. Okay, so my dream of the movie is it is set at Tatsinskaya Air Base, where the story started out that you're in this desperate resupply game. There are hundreds of planes. There were about 200 planes there, and it was the closest to the action. So, in a 1.5 hour flight, think Bombay Delhi distance, Bombay Bhopal distance, and you're going there, resupplying and coming back. You're going there, resupplying and coming back. It's a tight ship, it's a logistics operation. Planes are being repaired, there is a crew there. Now, the Soviets were very focused on logistics. Okay, that's a part of the so-called deep battle. The Soviet doctrine of war is you don't hit the enemy, you figure out their logistics and you hit the logistics, you choke the logistics. Okay, what the Ukrainians are doing to great effect against the Russian invaders in their country today, you go after the logistics. So Soviet intelligence understood that there is the Tatsinskaya airfield, which is being used to resupply the 6th Army. Now, that was like 80 kilometers inside German held territory. So the Soviets hatched a plan for the raid on Tatsinskaya, and it was almost a suicide operation. But a group of tanks and soldiers punched through the light German lines and headed for this airbase. And their surprise was complete. The operational surprise was complete. And the scouts at the edges of the airfield raised a warning only 10 minutes before T-34 tanks showed up at the airfield. And then you can think of the pandemonium at the airfield, that everybody simultaneously went mad. And with that kind of short notice, it's impossible to do a coordinated, harmonious response. So the response basically was nuts. Many planes with even inadequate fuel on the plane just tried to get on the airfield and run. Many planes crashed into each other, and all through there was artillery and tank fire hitting the airfields. And one of the most priceless little fragments of this story was that T-34 tanks located themselves at the edge of the run field and aligned their gun, and they would wait for a plane to take off and fire the tank projectile, which more or less flies in a straight line. And as the plane was just taking off, the tank projectile would hit the plane and the plane would blow up. So imagine tanks just standing there, and one by one the planes are desperately trying to leave and the tanks are destroying. The tanks were like, fat frogs grabbing one drone ant at a time. And that was the drama at Tatsinskaya airfield. So there were about 200 planes there. I seem to remember about 70 got destroyed, about 130 got away. And then they went back to that further airfield. But that was the end of the logistics operation to supply the 6th Army, because this airfield was close by. And so you could do those number of round trips. The other airfield was further away, and 70 planes had been destroyed, or 80 planes had been destroyed. So now you had fewer planes and they had to do longer trips. And so the supply of the 6th Army was just shattered. And then weeks later, Paulus surrendered. So this is just a memorable story that's stuck in my head. And, modern movie making can do justice to this, short of having a time machine. And yeah, I'm sure we can put a whole bunch of human drama around it. But I think the correct level of human drama is Dunkirk. That they didn't try to tell too much of a story, because actually the events are the grand drama on which, we get to see some human beings being painted.
I'm actually not a Christopher Nolan fanboy, but I thought Dunkirk was the best war film ever made. It was just brilliant, and I agree with you. And the story of this airfield is so fascinating because it is at once both a microcosm and a macrocosm. It is a microcosm in the sense that it is perhaps a pivotal war and a pivotal moment in World War II. And it's amazing how big things often hinge around little things, and this is one of the
Correct. So
different little things that.
epic drama. The fate of the world has to be on the line, and this is as close as you get to that. Stalingrad was that turning point of World War II where uh, the world understood that the mighty German Wehrmacht can be beaten. Until that, the Germans had never lost a fair fight, and 250,000 troops were captured, and Hitler was driven to unreasonable extremes of wasting resources on trying to solve the situation. So it was absolutely a critical moment. And just imagine this clever checkmate at the airfield that was of decisive importance in shaping the Battle of Stalingrad.
Yeah, and I love the way you refer to tanks as fat frogs. The last time you used that phrase, fat frogs, you were asking me to lose weight. So I'm happier in this context. It's not only that you can zoom out and see the whole of the war, you can also zoom in to a variety of human stories, because I can imagine this is such a great setting for human stories, as in the people at the airfield, the people who are
People on
planning
both
the whatever,
sides.
the people who are
Okay,
not
on
being
the
able to
Soviet
eat.
side, not widely understood is that for all practical purposes, this was a suicide mission because they were blasting deep into German held terrain, albeit lightly staffed. But those guys also fared very badly. But hey, they changed the world.
And somewhere in a back room, there is a thinker like you who is planning the operation, doing the logistics, looking at the data. That's your real hero for the story, isn't it?
Of course, yeah, no question.
No question.
Yeah, I mean, there is the thinking guys and there's the execution guys. Very well, Amit. Will you raise me with a better movie idea?
I don't want to raise you. We are not comparing the things here. I love your movie idea, and I'm sure you would watch my web series. So here's an idea for, I don't know whether it's a movie or a web series, but it again, it begins with one visual but two audios. And the visual is of a sepia tinted old room, perhaps a storeroom, and one soundtrack is a lock is being opened, and the door is pushed open, and you see this little room, and there's a trunk in the corner, and
Gentle reader, you see, I tell stories from history. This is a real thing. He's a movie maker.
no, I'm not a movie maker. I'm a lafanga. So yeah, so one soundtrack is the sounds of this door being opened, someone walking into the room, ruffling around, going towards that old rusted trunk in the ground, and the other soundtrack, and we don't know what that is right now, is the hesitant sound of somebody's feet somewhere running, stumbling, right? And we don't know what it is right now. And we move to the trunk, and the hand of this man opens the trunk, or the hand of this woman actually is more appropriate. A hand of a woman opens the latch of the trunk, pushes it up and looks deep inside, and the hand goes inside, and it picks up a sheaf of papers, yellowed, half torn papers, and picks them up. And at that point, you cut from that scene, and that soundtrack goes, and you just have the other soundtrack, and you're cutting into sort of a close up of a child's feet, which is kind of running somewhere. And then she stumbles and falls, and then the opening credits begin. Now I want to tell you this story. It's a story of a lady called Haimabati Sen. Right, she was born in 1866 in a village called Khulna, which is now in Bangladesh, but then part of Bengal. Um, really poor family, but her father is progressive. He wants his daughter to learn stuff. Now progressive, quote unquote, for the age. He wants his daughter to learn stuff and all of that, and so he starts kind of teaching her things. And there is a famine in 1872, 6 years after she's born. So she's 6 years old. See, we can do the math. And this little girl is found stealing rice from the store to give it to the poor who are starving outside. So we already have a sense that this is someone with spunk and initiative. And at one point later in the story, a sub inspector comes to the village, and he goes to the school, and there are all these boys and this one girl, and he asks a question, and only this girl knows the answer. So, at this point, he comments that, you know so much, it is a sure route to widowhood. Right. At another point, she starts reading books, and she reads the Ramayana, and her grandmother and her aunts are appalled. And they says that this girl is going to be a widow. She's going to break caste. She's becoming a masculine woman. Right. They disapprove. So, the family does the one thing that is done to women to make sure they don't become too learned and masculine. At the age of 9, she is married off to a 45-year-old widower. This 45-year-old widower has had two wives before who have passed away. He has two children, right? And during the day, Haimabati, who is 9 years old, plays with these two children, and she plays with their dolls because they are more or less the same age as her. During the night, she actually loses memory, but she remembers waking up naked and bleeding and hurt, right? And someone has to cover her up. And this is her life, and she suffers trauma. She starts fainting. So she's sent back for a brief while to her parental home. Where her father is also traumatized because this is a man who perhaps wanted something else for the girl, you know, but these are the early 1870s. He's also in a sense trapped by circumstance, trapped by patriarchy, trapped by society, all of these things. Anyway, she goes back to the husband. Then when she's 10 years old, the husband dies, and by the time she's 11, her parents are dead, her in-laws are dead, and she is a 12-year-old girl back in the village of Khulna, where her parents and in-laws and husband are all dead. She's a child widow, and no one wants to look after her. The money that was left for her is taken by her uncle. She's absolutely desolate. She's alone. What are you going to do? And I can tell you, Ajay Shah, if you and me were in her place, our lives would be over then. There is nothing you can do. It is done. A village in Khulna in the 1870s, and you're 12 years old and you're destitute and you're a child widow. And there are directions you can go in. There's a study that was done, I think, in Kolkata in 1853, which showed that the city had more than 12,000 prostitutes, of which many were child widows, because child marriage was a common thing, and because children were often married to men 30 years older than them, and because we know what life expectancy was, child widowhood was a common thing. But she didn't go there, right? You are wondering how she escaped the circumstances. Somehow she found her way to Benares. Somehow she educated herself. Somehow she became a doctor. Right, in the 19th century, where women didn't become doctors. Privileged women would find it hard to get an education, and this 12-year-old child widow from this village in Bengal goes to Benares, educates herself, becomes a doctor, gets married again, has kids again. I think, even if I remember correctly, and I've got to give credit where it is due, I first read about Haimabati Sen in this great book by Kavita Rao called Lady Doctors, and I had an episode with Kavita as well, excellent writer, and a book about lady doctors of the 19th century, and every one of them remarkable, because just to be a lady doctor, you had to be remarkable. A man could get there through inertia, just following the paths laid out. But to be a woman and to do this was remarkable. To be a 12-year-old child widow in a village in Bengal and to do this is defies belief. And if I remember correctly, Hemabati also went on to become, a prominent figure in the world of doctors, not just a doctor, but head of a guild and all of that. And in later years, also known to be a little unpleasant and snap at people, from what I remember. But here's the second part of the story. The second part of the story is circa 1920s. She starts writing her memoirs. In 1933, she dies. These memoirs, a whole bunch of papers, are locked away in a trunk, and they stay locked in a trunk for 80 years. They are found 80 years later when they're discovered, and the family doesn't really get the importance of those papers. But Tapan Rai Chaudhary, who then edited the collection and translated it, managed to convince him that, look, this is a big deal, what the hell are you doing? And her memoir is now available in print and on Kindle. Everybody can read it. Everybody can read the story of her life in her words, right? And imagine being locked in that trunk for 80 years, which is why I have that image at the start of a trunk being opened and the papers being discovered, and later a child's feet, running perhaps somewhere in the village, before this rumble and fall. And you can also perhaps juxtapose this with another parallel narrative of a descendant of that family. And now we go into fictional territory, but a descendant of the family who finds the papers and who, in an apparently more modern world where things are better for women, is in a low key way living out an entirely different set of struggles, and what her great great grandmother's life could possibly mean to her. So I find this an incredibly inspiring story. What a web series it would make. And I'm just blown away that stories like this are not told. Why is this not a web series? Why is this not a film? What are you doing? So, Ajay, what is your next story?
Very mundane compared to yours. It's not a tangible story, but it's actually a theme. Uh, Something like what I'm about to describe occurred about 10 times. Okay, so I can pick any one of them and talk them in more detail, but it just struck me as a situation that was interesting and fascinating. And as I said, it occurred about 10 times, and it could be woven into many alternative movie designs. This concerns river crossings. Okay, so once again, we are back in the Eastern Front in World War II, and the Soviets covered 2,500 kilometers from Stalingrad to Berlin in about 500 days. 2,500 kilometers is a distance from Ludhiana to Kanyakumari. Okay, so imagine blasting through 5 kilometers a day from Ludhiana to Kanyakumari over a period of about 500 days. In that, there would be many rivers, right? Because there are rivers and there would be river crossings. And again, there was a focal point that was a river and one bridge. The Germans were on the run, and each time there was a desperate project of getting across the river. So here are the issues. On the Soviet side, you are 20, 50 kilometers away from the bridge. And at that time, in those days, there was a lack of precision fires. So when we've discussed Ukraine, what has changed today is that there are precision fires, and it is possible to precisely take out the bridges on the Dnipro River. In those days, fires were horrendously imprecise, meaning a shell or a bomb would land vaguely in that region. So there was some time and that bridge would hold. It was not easy to destroy the bridge. But on the other side of the bridge, that is on the Soviet side of the bridge, was a vast German army, their equipment, their stores, their people. And all of them desperate to get across that one bridge, that one funnel of the bridge. And each time it was a problem. So there needed to be strategic decisions of what equipment we leave behind, what stores we leave behind, what we take back. Okay, and there were always physical constraints. There was a operations problem of how many vehicles a day of what characteristics can make it across that bridge, because the bridge is a finite resource. And what would happen is that the tired, scared, desperate men would lose their temper and just break ranks and be undisciplined. And if it becomes a mob, then the whole thing breaks down, because the only way to use a bridge like this correctly is to use it smoothly. So, to use a fluid mechanics analogy, what you want is a laminar flow and not a turbulent flow. It is essential to plan it, to manage it properly. And the place where the madness of this went off in my head was when I read that at several of these bridge crossings, the German military police killed 10 to 20 German soldiers so as to hold the discipline. That was the level of desperation of the German side, because the Red Army is on their tail. Every moment the Red Army is getting closer, and however imprecise, you are under fire from the Red Army and an increasingly capable Red Air Force. So think of each bridge as a choke point where there is a trapped army and its equipment and its stores. And the Red Army is just throwing everything they got to make their life miserable. And the German side is trying to do that careful, logical planning. What shall we take out? What is the bandwidth of the pipe? How should we organize ourselves to take this across effectively? And there is the madness of maintaining discipline to actually do an orderly transition across the river. So these scenes play in my head, and I thought that, it could be used as a lovely backdrop in which a beautiful movie can be made.
Lovely. And this reminds me of two things, and one of them is I did an episode of The Seen and the Unseen with our mutual friend Devanshu Datta, and he pointed out that he had four great grandfathers or four grandfathers. Does one have four grandfathers or
For two grandfathers and four great grandfathers.
right? So he had
We
four
have
great
8
grandfathers.
great grandparents.
Okay, I got the math. He had four great grandfathers, and three of them were eminent people who had colleges and institutions named after them. The fourth one was a river pirate. And he was a river pirate in Bengal who would do his river piracy dressed in a dhuti and, the typical sort of the Bengali this thing. And I think there's some kind of movie there also. So if Devanshu is watching, perhaps I could, convince him to pen down, the memoirs of his ancestors. Like, how does one do that? What am I even saying? And the other thing I want to point out to our gentle readers is that, gentle readers, if you're wondering about his love for military action and military strategy, I would urge you to check out this episode of The Seen and the Unseen we did on Ukraine, 5.5 hour episode, masterclass. We did a follow up of that on Everything is Everything. And after you did that talk, and I think even before you did that talk, you've been called to give talks to the Indian Army. That you've actually spoken with generals and given them lectures on military strategy, etc., etc. A side of you that not many are aware of.
One of 16.
One of 16. Okay, we are kind of getting there. We are completing the list.
Okay, Amit, tell us your next idea for something playing in your mind that ought to be a movie or a web series.
Or a web series is right, because this is an absolute web series idea. You won't be surprised to hear me speak of this, because I have spoken of this before. There is a great book by Kumi Kapoor called The Emergency: A Personal History. I've done an episode with Kumiji also. I adore the book. It is a remarkable book. And I think everyone should really read this book. Not just to read about a particular important period of our history, but to also understand the fundamental nature of the Indian state and, the oppressive power that it wields and the damage that it can do. And I think that is increasingly relevant. But we should sort of read that book, because it is dangerous to forget history. History, of course, as we know, doesn't repeat itself. It rhymes, but it rhymes in disturbing ways. And so it's important to kind of read this. Now, there are many elements to this book. All our viewers would know the basic facts of the emergency, so I won't kind of go over them, but I'm fascinated by a number of angles. One is a human angle. All the different interesting characters in this. Like, there is Indira Gandhi, for example. Now, whatever mistakes her father might have made, her father was a man of conviction. He did what he believed was always the right thing to do. He did some great things, he made some mistakes. Indira, on the other hand, I believe, was a pure sociopath. And you see evidence of this in a letter to Sanjay Gandhi written in the late 60s, which Kumiji reproduces in this book, where she essentially says that we don't care about left or right, we only care about power. And it's a private letter to her son. She assumed it would not be found. But people look at the leftward authoritarian tilt of the Congress in the late 60s, where she did bank nationalizations and, all those terrible economic decisions, which I consider to be a crime on humanity, because they kept millions of people in poverty for decades longer than they otherwise would have been. And it wasn't about ideology. It was a political tactical move, because she was trying to distance herself from her rivals in the Congress.
On this theme, it's insightful to not use the words left and right, but actually what's going on is just populism. Populism is the game of igniting the hatred against elites, and it's an evergreen strategy, and it's wielded by the left or the right. But actually, at heart, it's the same. It's an unscrupulous game of grabbing power and stoking hatred of the elites.
Right. And one member of the syndicate in the late 60s she's fighting against is Morarji Desai, who comes up as a major character later on in the story. And I find her an interesting character. I don't want to judge her. People are a product of their circumstances and where they come from. When she was 13 years old, her aunt, Nehru's sister, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, once described her as ugly and stupid. And this apparently had a deep impression on her. She had demons of her own she was fighting. She had baggage of her own. But obviously she was where she was because she was Nehru's daughter. But obviously that also made things difficult for her in many different ways. So that is one story. Sanjay Gandhi is fascinating. Again, sort of an utterly unsympathetic character. Who, as a young man, he would steal the hubcaps of cars, and he would, steal the Mercedes symbol. If you remember, in the 70s and the 80s, people would steal that Mercedes symbol from Mercedes and they put it on their ambassador or their Fiat, and that symbol alone that logo would become a status symbol, even if everyone knew the car was whatever it was. But he started Maruti, which is not the Maruti we know today, but an earlier version, to manufacture his own car. And Kumiji's book has enormous details of the things he did. He would call up industrialists and say that, listen, you invest in this, you buy so many shares, or I'll have you raided, or you'll go to jail, using the coercive power of the state. And all this before the emergency. And during the emergency, and we've done an earlier episode on population, why population density is a good thing, and sterilization is the worst kind of coercion. And as everybody knows, Sanjay Gandhi took that kind of to a new level. But before I elaborate on that, there are side characters in this I find incredibly interesting. Like there is Vidyacharan Shukla, right? When Vidyacharan Shukla was, I think, Information and Broadcasting
INB,
Minister,
yeah.
INB Minister, and he called all the editors of Delhi to his office, and he said that not one bad word against Indira Gandhi, right? And most of the media, barring exceptions like Ramnath Goenka of the Express and all that, but most of the media was compliant. They gave way, and in L.K. Advani's memorable words, when asked to bend, they chose to crawl. Right? That's sort of what happened there. Simon Jenkins, I think, who was in Newsweek, once said that, listen, I have covered, Spain's Franco. I have seen China's Mao, or rather, I have seen Franco's Spain and Mao's China, but I have never seen, this kind of a crackdown on the press. S. Nihal Singh, who was editor of The Statesman, spoke of, the then editor of the Times of India. I won't name him, but he said that this man, all through the emergency, he followed every order of Vidyacharan Shukla. And yet, the day the emergency was over and the next party was in power, he wrote a 2-page opinion piece ranting against Indira Gandhi. And we see hypocrites like that today. We see a pliant media like that today as well. So, important to kind of note, though I don't want to draw too many parallels, viewers can do that for themselves. And Vidyacharan Shukla was also, I see him in a sense as a kind of Gollum. Gollum in Lord of the Rings, who was sort of enslaved by his desires and by his lust for power and all of that, and couldn't do anything about it, and ends up as a pitiful character. And Vidyacharan Shukla, like that, he's a minister. He's an incredible sycophant to Indira Gandhi. At one point, where it is being discussed that should we have a presidential system, Vidyacharan Shukla said, "Oh, behan ko president bana do for life." You know, no need for elections. Democracy. People like VC Shukla and Sanjay Gandhi openly spoke against the idea of ever doing an election again. And it's interesting, there is a poignant end to this, because in 2013, Vidyacharan Shukla, by then, really old, I think in his 80s or 90s, completely irrelevant, in fact, irrelevant for decades, actually tried to go to a Congress rally somewhere in central India and was killed in an Axle attack. Right. And that's interesting. And when I read that, I didn't know what to make of it. A part of me says a human being has been killed. You should be sad. But I have read about all the things he did during the emergency, and I found it hard to be sad. And among all that, he was, of course, among the way power corrupted him. Kumiji writes in a book about how actresses Vidya Sinha and Katie Mirza, complained that this man had, hit on them. And because he was a minister can have everything. India of the 70s, what it was like. So an absolutely obnoxious man, another obnoxious man, Bansi Lal. Bansi Lal was chief minister of Haryana. And at one point, there was an advocate in one of these Haryana cities, I've forgotten which one, Faridabad or whatever, where this advocate protested, an old advocate, a respected person, perhaps in his 60s and 70s. He had the advocate arrested, stripped naked, he had his face tarred, and he had him paraded through the town. This is in India. This is in modern India. It is not in some feudal, Middle Eastern place from the Middle Ages. And this was Bansi Lal. And I'll come back to sterilization, and I'll come back. Like, Bansi Lal was one of Sanjay's key lieutenants, and in terms of brutality, outdid any of the other key lieutenants. And there is this famous story, and this is not an outlier story. It's an illustration of what was happening at the time. That this sterilization campaign was, of course, being carried out, and you had hospitals who would refuse to admit patients, refuse to admit pregnant mothers unless they could show a Nasbandi certificate or a, sterilization certificate. It was monstrous. There was this village called Pipli. So I think this is an event from 1976. Pipli is, I think, north of Delhi. It's in Haryana. It's a Haryana village, so under Bansi Lal's jurisdiction. So at one point, there was a gentleman named Hawa Lal who was an aging widower. He was taken away for a Nasbandi because the government had to meet its targets, had to meet its quota. He was taken away for a Nasbandi, and he died during the operation. Right? And then there was uproar in the village. and the block district magistrate, the BDM or whatever, he takes a bunch of soldiers, and they after this has happened, they want to pick up more people for sterilization. So there is the first person they see is a cobbler on the road, and they pick him up to get him forcibly sterilized. And at this point, the people of Pipli, who have already lost an elderly man they loved so much, cannot take it anymore. And there are protests in Pipli, and hundreds of people come from neighboring villages, and they're all protesting. And at this point, the senior to the BDM, I forget what the post is, he gets hundreds of police, and they march on these villages, and there is actually a siege of the village where the police with guns is conducting a siege on the village. And at 6 a.m. one morning, shots are fired, and there are two women who are making cow dung cakes outside, and they are shot dead. Right, and then the rest of the village comes out and submits to the Nasbandi. And this is sort of a famous and stark story, but you have stories like this happening throughout during those years. And I'm thinking all of these are individual human stories. Like if I had an episode on this incident, I'd probably begin with one of these two women doing something completely normal, spending time with a kid, having a quiet moment with her husband, show them as actual human beings with dreams, with aspirations, with hundreds of stories within them, a life to live. And then in the middle of the episode, boom, you're gunned down. That's the whole story. That's what's happening there. And while all this is happening, the entire opposition is in jail. Here's an interesting statistic for you. Indira Gandhi locked up more people during the emergency than the British did during the Quit India movement. Right? And this includes all, like you and I today, we would be in jail. Period. The entire opposition was in jail. Like you said, populist movement, distrust of elites, academics were put in jail. The entire Sanskrit department of Delhi University was put in jail randomly. Sanskrit sikhate hai, jail mein dalo. That was a story. There is a really poignant story of this actress called Snehalata Reddy. Right, Snehalata Reddy was a cultured lady. She acted in theater, she acted in films, she had deep interest in poetry. Her husband was a poet and a filmmaker, if I recall correctly. And her crime was she was a friend of George Fernandez, who was on the run, right? So they arrested her. She was treated badly. She had asthma. She wasn't allowed to take treatment. By one description, she went in a young, beautiful woman. She came out looking old and haggard and whatever. And shortly after her release, and she was in jail for a long time, shortly after her release, when the emergency was over, she died of a heart attack. And you can ascribe this particular death definitely to what the regime did. Artists were locked up. You dare not be an artist. And if you're an artist, you have to sing the tune that you're asked to sing, which many artists did, right? That's a whole game. It's not, we see it in populist regimes throughout history. So all of this was happening. Then eventually, of course, the nightmare was over, the emergency was over, elections were called. And there is even an interesting story here, and I'll end with the story because it's such a beautiful story, and I think this can actually be the start of the web series, where you have two parallel scenes playing out, you're intercutting between them. You could even do a split screen. And one of them is that you're backstage at some event, you don't really know where, but there is a portly man in a pajama kurta who looks like a politician because, hey, he is, as we find out, spoiler alert. And, he's kind of getting ready and he's a little nervous, his feet are shaking, and then he puts a cap on his head, right? That's one scene. And the other scene is there's a television set, right? You just see first a pixelated screen and you pull back and it's that 1970s television set, those little boxes that we had with legs that used to stand, and a family is huddled around it and they are watching something. And on the screen, you see Dimple Kapadia. Right. And what's happening here? What's happening here is that sometime in 77, I think, JP Narayan had this rally where Jagjeevan Ram was supposed to speak. And the government of the day, which was still Indira Gandhi, was worried about this rally. So they told Doordarshan that we need to distract the people, make sure nobody goes to the rally, show the film Bobby. Right? Bobby, of course, released in 1973, but it's such a huge hit. And show the film Bobby. And the assumption was everybody will stay home to see Bobby. Nobody will go to the rally. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but I think even those who love the film Bobby won't mind my saying this. The rally was packed. Right? And the headline the next day in the paper, and you got to, now I must reveal that Jagjeevan Ram's nickname was Babu. And the headline in the newspaper the next day was Babu beats Bobby. And it is just the greatest fucking headline in independent India's history. So I find this a fascinating story at so many levels. There are so many human stories, including of Kumi ji and her husband Virender Kapoor, a brave journalist. There is a story about how Virender Kapoor was imprisoned, and at one time Virender Kapoor he's shifting jails. So he's in this kind of a van kind of thing, police van kind of thing, and he wants to send a message to Kumi that मेरा jail shift हो रहा है, मुझे ये बरेली के station में मिलो, I'll be able to see you there because that's when the train comes. So he writes something on a little parchi and he drops it from the back of the van, and there is a gentleman there behind on a scooter, right? And he sees a parchi drop out of the van. He doesn't pick it up. He waits till the van is out of sight. He picks up the parchi. He sees a message for Kumi Kapoor ji with the landline phone number or whatever. He gets a message to her. She goes to Bareilly. She meets him, where Virender Kapoor and three other prisoners are being put into the jail. And at the same time, and the scene is so cinematic, at the same time as she's saying goodbye to her husband, and at that time you don't know if it's going to end and whether you'll see them again. There are chants in favor of the Congress happening at another end of the platform because a Congress politician is also getting into the train and there's a crowd there to see him off. So you sort of, see the juxtaposition there, which is so fascinating. And another thing that makes me really sad, you know, many of the dissenters of the day are in politics today, or came to politics eventually. Arun Jaitley was a young law student then, and he fought vigorously. He went to jail. He wrote in detail about his experiences in jail, which themselves are fascinating. How people used to crave to be near the one transistor radio that someone had, so they could listen to the news and try and figure out what's happening, and they'd have to listen to BBC. They'd have to try to catch it in the airwaves because there's nothing that you're getting from here. And another, interesting story, which is that Subramaniam Swami was on the run during those days, and he would dress up as a Sardar with a pagri and a kara and all of that, and he would try to escape. And when one of the places he went to hide was Ahmedabad, because that still wasn't ruled by a Gujarat, didn't have a Congress government at that time. So he'd go to Ahmedabad, and he'd hide out at this place of the gentleman named Makaran Desai. And at the station, there would be an RSS Karyakarta who would meet him, take him from the station to Mr. Desai's house. That RSS Karyakarta was Narendra Modi. And I have to ask at this point that, if I was that young person, the lesson I would take from this is how dangerous power is. And I would determine to myself that if I am ever in power, I will be different. I will treat the opposition with dignity. I will let the press say what they want. That is a lesson I would draw. I'm not sure that lesson has been drawn, but whatever. That is, so it's just an incredibly fascinating story with such great characters. The canvas is vast. If you go a little before the emergency to JP Narayan's movement, all the modern leaders who shaped Bihar, from Lalu Prasad Yadav to Nitish Kumar, they are like young activists at the time. So it is a crucible. It is a crucible. It is also a reflection of our society. It's just such a mind-blowing story. So Ajay, I'm out of breath. Time for you to tell your story.
No, you go first. I want my story to be the last word.
Oh, you want to end with a bang? Okay, cool. So I'll go first. So this is actually a work of fiction. It's a book I wanted to write a few years ago based on some news that came out, right? So there was news that came out about this young student who's gone missing from his hostel. And the student was, of course, politically active and all that, but he'd just gone missing from his hostel room and nobody could figure out what the hell happened, ladka kahan gaya. And I thought at that point that I'll write a quick novel and it'll have two parallel narratives, right? And one parallel narrative is a pretty straight-laced narrative that all of these people discover that this young man is missing, and then they deal with his absence as the story proceeds. And, as we both know, someone's absence can become a strong presence in your life. And his absence has that same role on his family and the people around him. Perhaps his mother was living vicariously through him, and she now has to deal with the loss of that and of trying to figure out how to live. Perhaps perhaps his father looks back on their relationships and realized that for much of his life he was also missing in a different sense of the term. Perhaps his friends get reflect on their friendship and the political environment and all that, but that's one track of the story. The other track of the story is that the boy is not missing, everyone else is. The boy wakes up one day, comes out of his hostel room, and no one's there. Humanity has vanished. The streets are empty. There are signs of civilization in all the buildings and the roads and the traffic lights and all of that, but there are no people. And then so he has to navigate, he has to figure out what the fuck happened, and obviously it's surreal, so you never figure that out. But he has to now live alone in this world. And I'm reminded of that beautiful phrase, the looking glass self. Like, so often ourselves are formed by the reflections we see in the eyes of others, right? We are formed by what the people that we are with, by what they think of us, by what we want them to think of us, and so on and so forth. So if other people vanish, what is the self? How does it shape itself? How does one live? What does one want? What does one live for? you know what are the horrors of an idle mind with no one to talk to and nothing to do? So I found these two sort of parallel narratives great for a book I wanted to write called Missing. Now, ordinarily I would not give this idea away, but at this moment I don't care, because I have like 30 ideas which I consider more important, and I haven't, I would need to get down to writing them first. So I just
How
think
many
this would
of
be a
your
great
book
film.
ideas have sat idle? How many of them have actually got a publishing agreement?
No, no. So, my publisher is VK Karthika of Westland. Every time I give her an idea, she says, Amit, write it, I'll publish it. So, that is really, I think she's kind of given up on me. I'm behind on some stuff I have to deliver to her. It's really sad. And by the way, I did write one shitty novel called My Friend Sancho in 2009. And the great filmmaker Govind Nihalani, who made films like Arsatya and Party, he reached out to me and said he wanted to make a film on it. And I was struck because by that time I had enough distance from the book to know that it's a very slight book. So I was like, why do you want to make a film on it? But anyway, so I did a sort of a treatment note for him, which he took around within Bollywood, and nobody bit. Which is remarkable because not because the story is great, but because this is a great man. If someone like Govindji comes to me as a producer, I will not care what his story is. I will say, "Sir, aap banao." you know and that didn't happen. And I remember, and this is an interesting nugget, that one day he told me that, Amit, Hindi film industry mein kuch nahi hoga, but the Marathi film industry is very promising. This was circa 2010. And he said the Marathi film industry today reminds me of the Hindi film industry in the early 1980s, where alternate cinema was, sparkling, Sham Benegal and so on were at the peak of the powers. He made Art Satya around that time. So he said, let's, shift the scene to Pune, and can you do me a treatment around that? And I did a two-pager for him. And then I just felt embarrassed and very sad it wasn't happening. And without meaning to, I sort of stopped meeting him. I kind of ghosted him in a way without intending to. So it's kind of horrible. And what happens is, once you realize that you've ghosted someone, it's very difficult to go back and say that, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. But the project was going nowhere. So Govindji, if you're watching this, I'm really sorry. Big admirer, huge fan.
Talking about movies and production agreements, my parents' story was optioned.
Your parents' story was optioned.
Yeah.
What
So
the
my
fuck?
parents were in intercaste marriage. They eloped 3 times. The first 2 times were terrible, violent events. And then they ran and ran and did not stop running till they reached Banaras. They secretly got an Arya Samaj marriage and so on. So there was a lot of drama. And so it was optioned but never turned into a movie.
Oh my God. We got to dig into this a little bit more. This is quite fascinating. And out of that great, romantic, courageous affair emerges a boring card carrying economist. What a waste.
Yeah, what a waste.
So, Ajay, I'm done with my 4 stories. You're done with only 2. It was going to be 4 and 3. So, batao, sir, what is your last story?
Okay, so I want to tell a story which is at once a story about the world, but I hope by the time I'm done, the great movie maker Amit Varma will agree that there is a movie in this. Okay, so I want to start in the early 20th century. There was Soviet Russia, and there were the horrors of Soviet Russia. And one by one, some of the great people started understanding that there is something truly rotten inside Soviet Russia. Okay, and one of those key people was Arthur Koestler. So, along with George Orwell, Albert Camus, these are people, I think in Lionel Trilling's words, who lived at the dark crossroads of literature and politics and wrote books that mattered. and change the world. So, one book that Arthur Koestler wrote is called Darkness at Noon. I'm going to dive into the journey of the writing of that book. So, it's a book where he's trying to take a deep dive into the minds of the great communist leaders of Soviet Russia who were appearing in court and appearing to confess to grotesque crimes, and they had been tortured, they had been intimidated, or they had understood their own mistakes and the disaster that they had brought to the world called communism. Okay, there was this whole psychological puzzle about understanding their minds. So yes, there was torture and there was intimidation, but there was also something more going on in their minds. Arthur Koestler wrote a book which is both a story and an indictment of Soviet Russia and a psychological journey inside the minds of those people. Okay, and it's a truly great book. Now, at the time, so Koestler was Hungarian and his native language was German. He was living with his girlfriend, Daphne Hardy, who was a 21-year-old art student from the UK. They were living together in Paris. And it was August of 1940, and the Germans had invaded France. Okay, so they were living in Paris, and there was that frantic creative moment where Arthur Koestler was writing pages in German and giving them to her, and she was simultaneously translating into English. Okay, and so they were living together in some dingy Paris slum, and they were building this together. And you can imagine that moment, that desperation, the fire, where you have another totalitarian monster swallowing France. And the problem was that Daphne Hardy's German was not so good. So she knew German, but it was not so good. And she was not deeply steeped in the backdrop of communism and Soviet Russia. So there are many things going on inside the book where she was not able to say them correctly in English, or she would use terms. So, for example, when there would be an interrogation, she would call it a hearing. And a hearing sounds very mild. So, a lot of the monstrosity of that experience was not correctly done by her because she had no idea how monstrous Soviet Russia was. Okay, so she was just more naive about the world, and so his words in German were not being correctly done by her. On the other hand, hey, she was his lover. She was there with him. She was talking with him. She had the feeling of the book. And he was looking at the English translations as well. Okay, late in the project, the Germans reached Paris. Okay, and then these guys were on the run. And you will remember the history after they reached Paris. Basically, France surrendered and Marshal Pétain collaborated with the Germans. So now this was an even bigger problem because Arthur Koestler was a wanted man in 16 countries or something like that. And if the Germans got him, it would be the end. And he was actually put into an internment camp. And the only reason he got away was because of bad identity infrastructure. So, gentle reader, if you ever think that digital identity is such a great thing, think twice. So, he only got away because they didn't know he was
No Aadhaar
Arthur
in the time.
Koestler. Yeah. So, at that time, Daphne and Arthur Koestler split. She was British, and at that time, Britain was not yet at war, or Hitler was treating British citizens relatively well. She had the manuscript, which was dangerous because it was a lethal manuscript. It was a political novel, and no German policeman would have liked it. So she hid it, and she got to the port of Marseille and got evacuated back to England. Whereas Arthur Koestler was hiding inside France, got interned, managed to have the Germans not know who he was, and made his way out. He escaped. I think he walked across to Spain through the Pyrenees. Okay, like that. Now, before they split, he took the German text of his manuscript and put it in a post box to his book editor in Switzerland. Okay, so you just mentioned your editor in Westland. Okay, so these are like some of the most important people in the world. Tarini Uppal, okay, please do these great things for me in the rest of my life. And he posted it to his editor in Switzerland and said, please publish this. And he had a dull title for the book. His working title for the book was Ruboshov: a novel, okay, which is not a great title for a book. Daphne went to England and managed to sell the English manuscript to a publisher, and she chose a new title. Okay, again, being his lover, she could take liberties. She chose a new title without consulting him. Hey, there was a war going on. He was out of reach. There were no phones. And she chose the title Darkness at Noon. Okay, and that book was phenomenal. It was really, really influential. It changed the world. Um, there is a very real sense that in 1946, when elections took place in France, that book tipped the balance and the Communist Party lost in France in 1946 because of this book, where the people read this book and they suddenly understood that Soviet Russia is not what we have been sold as it is. They understood the human horror of these authoritarian regimes. And this is something that speaks to us across the ages, because I feel even today so much about the basics of liberal democracy and authoritarian regimes has not been internalized by a lot of people. Okay, so that is the story of the book of Darkness at Noon. And I think of George Orwell and Arthur Koestler as key partners in the great 20th century journey, alongside Milton Friedman and Hayek and George Stigler, in the great battle of ideas about authoritarian and populist philosophies versus the idea of liberal democracy. Again, this book was really important and really influential. Okay, sounds nice? Okay, many, many years later, in 2015, the German manuscript in Switzerland was rediscovered. Okay, so can you imagine all these years, all we had was the translation by Daphne Hardy. In 2015, Ruboshov: a novel turned up in the hands of some graduate student. And glory be that graduate student instantly understood what he was looking at. And then we got a modern translation of this book. And I have already cheated with some spoilers because I've given you a flavor about the ways in which that translation was amazing and the ways in which Daphne, had flaws in how she did the translation. Today we are inside the archives, the Kremlin archives, which were briefly opened in a magical period before Putin went back to a very harsh world. And today's translator is able to juxtapose the amazing knowledge Arthur Koestler, as an ex-communist himself, had of what was going on in Stalin's Russia. Okay, it is very clear that he had spoken with people. He really knew how the interrogations and the torture and the mental agony inside those people, he was able to take us inside their minds because he knew what was going on. But today's translation is able to have that omniscient understanding of the events, and a great modern translator knew German and knew English. And so today we have a 2015 translation of the book as well. So, dear reader, I commend you. Please read these books, and you know what? Read both versions. So, I just want to show you my two most prized possessions. This is the 1941 edition. I got it from my father. It is the happiest thing I have. And this is the 2015 edition.
What a magnificent story. And really inspiring. And this reminded me of something. And as we aren't really doing recommendations today, we were just going to talk about these. But a recommendation did come to mind, so I'll end with it. And that is a book by the great writer Stefan Zweig called The World of Yesterday. And this is like a memoir. Stefan Zweig was born, I think, in the 1880s, died in 1942. Just after he turned 60, I think, escaping the horrors of what was happening in Europe. And he has this memorable passage in his book, which I want to read out. All the pale horses of the apocalypse have stormed through my life. Revolution and famine, currency depreciation and terror, epidemics and emigration. I have seen great mass ideologies grow before my eyes and spread. Fascism in Italy, National Socialism in Germany, Bolshevism in Russia, and above all, the ultimate pestilence that has poisoned the flower of our European culture, nationalism in general. Inspiring words. We don't really need to say anything else. So, yeah, so thank you for sharing all that, Ajay. And may some of these movies and web series get made, and we can also be celebrities and walk red carpets and all that. You couldn't even wear a red shirt.